Hi, Irv. Hi, Vic.
Hi, you again, Fred. How
I
are
could
you?
say the same thing. Yeah.
Yes. I just, they have a speaker at the Kollel this
I
evening.
know. And they had it
And
on Zoom also. I saw that.
yeah, I just left it. They didn't come on. No one came on until about 8:15.
Oh, wow.
And then a nice young man kind of introduced the rabbi, and then I said, you know what? I think I'm up for Rabbi Neuman's class.
Yeah.
How you doing?
Rosh Yeshiva or not, I want Rabbi Neuman. He's the Rosh here.
Yeah.
Rosh Hashul.
I'm
Okay.
flattered. I'm flattered.
But they had like 30 people online. I don't know how many people were there, but it sounded decent, when they clapped on the introduction. So it's a nice turnout, I think.
Okay, good. Well, Beyonce is great. He's a wonderful. I had a relationship with him when I was in the University of Maryland. So he was down the road in Kent Mill. He was the head of a little yeshiva there.
Wow.
He's great. He's a very, very humble but insightful rabbi. He's great. A lot of fun. Okay, we're gonna get started. I imagined that this week was gonna be a smaller class because of the conflict, but it is what it is. I missed last week and we missed a couple weeks beforehand, and I just I couldn't justify skipping another week. So it's good. It's all good. And for those who missed this, they'll be okay. But my goal for tonight is to spend a little bit of time trying to build for us the baseline of why this topic is so complicated. Because one of the things that I found amazing is how there are certain assumptions that people make about various aspects of how you calculate fruit or vegetables in terms of their Shmitta status. And the reality is that it shouldn't be so complicated. I just muted everybody. If you want to unmute yourselves, you still can. So feel free to. Okay, so let me just grab my source sheet. If you recall, last time we did two things. Number one, we discussed the prohibition of taking Peros Shvius outside of Israel and why that's a problem. And even though we explained that there might be possibilities for why or how you can justify certain things like esrogim or whatnot, which we didn't really get into details, but we talked in broader context about it. Generally speaking, we try to avoid Peros Shvius, the produce that's produced on the seventh year, from being taken out of Israel. That's point one. And point number two, excuse me, is that the esrog is a fascinating little sugya by itself. It's its own topic about what exactly, how do we determine the time frame of a year in the context of an etrog. And we noted that there was a debate in the Gemara between the Chachamim and the Chachmei Usha, whether esrog should follow Lakita, or which is when it's picked, or Chanata, which we're going to talk about what Chanata is tonight. But Chanata normally means when it first begins to form. So whether the etrog follows Chanata or Lakita in terms of defining what year it becomes a Shemitah produce, and also what year it's part of Meiser, right? If you recall, we talked about the duck, duck, goose schedule of every 7-year cycle, is that there's different trumot different masrot that you have to give, which are gifts that you have to give to specific people. So again, you have truma, which is about 2% of your income you give to the Kohen. Then after that, you have meiser, which is again 10% goes to Levi, and there's a portion that is this other meiser, which is called either meiser sheni, second meiser, second tithe, which is stuff that you take to Yerushalayim and eat there, or you redeem on money and then use that money in Yerushalayim and buy food there. Or on years 3 and 6, it's called Meiser Ani. It's a special tie that you give to the poor. Okay, so we explained that it's important to determine what year every single part of your produce is part of to know what Truma and Meiser calculation you're figuring out, right? Just like a fiscal year, just like when you have any other year, you have to know, right? Even on Rosh Hashanah, right? Which Averos are you atoning for, right? This year, so you need to know what the year is. What year are we talking about? So Truma, Meiser, Shvius, Shmita, all these things require to know the year. Not only that, but you have to know at what point in the process of fruit or vegetables being created, you have to know at what point are these things becoming what we would call peirot shvius, things that are associated with Shmita. Is it when they are first formed? Is it when they're almost fully formed? Is it when they're picked? How do you determine? And we're going to kind of go back to the Mishnayos, go back to the source to try to unpack what makes this topic a little bit of a mess. Okay, so let's jump in. Mishnah Shvius Hey Aleph, the Mishnah from Shvius. This is the Mesechet in Zraim, which again is the first of the 6 Sidrei Mishnah. So Shvius is one of the Mesechtot in that Seder, in that unit. And it talks about all the laws of Shmita. In the 5th chapter, the first Mishnah, it says, Benos Suach. So in parentheses is the biur of the Reisman. And this is the biur is what I call the biur is kind of his more elaborate notes on the bottom. In parentheses are kind of his like art scroll translations in Hebrew of the words that come before it. So Benos Suach, so what is this Benos Suach that he's talking about? So there's these things, Te'enim Livanot, white figs. So apparently there are these figs out there that Shvi'it Shelahan Shnia. Their Shemitah year is the 2nd year of the cycle. What does that mean? So normally the Shemitah year for produce is the 7th year. And we're saying that the Shemitah year for the white figs is basically 3 years later. It's not the 7th year. It's not the 1st year of the cycle. It's the 2nd year of the next cycle. How does that work? These fruits, these white figs, are their year of Shemitah is the 2nd year in the Shemitah cycle. Shehein osos the shalosh shanim, because it takes them basically 3 years to go from their inception to being fully formed. That they only kind of become fully mature, ready to be eaten by the 3rd year after their initial, right, chanata, which again, we're defining as the stage of when they first form. We're going to see 2 positions as to what the chanata means very, very shortly. But this Mishnah, again, gives this a little bit of an absurd case. It's right. Most things do not work this way. Most things have a seasonal, right, structure where they grow a season and then you pick them and it's all done within a couple of months, the whole thing, the beginning, the middle, the end, maybe a year, right? But most things follow a single year cycle. These things are more complicated. So the explanation that's given for this Mishnah is a little bit of background. Says the biur of the Reisman, Lefi Rov Harishonim, according to the majority of medieval commentators, Chanata, the definition of Chanata, he zman shebo nofel haperach umatchil pri katan livkoat tachtav. This is the moment when the budding flowers of the tree fall off and the fruit begins to grow in its place, right? The way that most fruit grow is that first a tree will bud a flower and the flower will fall off, and in its place, that's where the fruit of the tree is going to grow. Okay, so what's Chanata? Says the Reisman, many Rishonim define Chanata as the time when the flower falls off, which is a pretty defined moment. Just to give you an example of this, Rashi Bamidbar, Parshas Korach, this is in the context of when Aaron is trying to, when Moshe is trying to prove that Aaron is in fact a leader chosen by God, so they take the staffs of all the different Shvatim's leadership and put them in the tabernacle. And sure enough, the only staff that anything happens to is Aaron's staff. It basically starts to sprout almond branches and almonds. So, excuse me. So in that context, when it talks about the sprouts that are on this staff, Rashi defines hu chanatas hapri. This is referring to the inception of the pri, kisheperach nofel, which is when the flower falls off. So literally, right, Rashi just totally derech agav, meaning he's not talking about our topic. He's not talking about Shmita, not talking about Meiser. He just defines the word chanata in his parish on the Torah. And for those who are paying attention, if you were wondering, what does chanata mean? Rashi says chanata, inception of the fruit, is when the flower of the bud falls off. Okay, so this is an example of what the Reisman calls the majority opinion as to what chanata looks like. However, Ulam, Harambam, Maimonides, has a different definition of chanata, it seems. Mashma shechanata hi behagia hapri la'onas ha'ma'asros. And this is going to be an important term for us to define. But the Rambam says that chanata, this inception, is when the fruit reaches the time that Meiser kicks in. So we have to talk about, what does that mean? What does it mean, the time that Meiser kicks in? Shehu shalish hagidu. And so the Reisman fills in, what is onas ha'ma'asrot? What is this time period that Meiser kicks in? He says it's when a fruit reaches a third of its growth. When it reaches a third of its growth. So again, if you go back to this original Gemara here, so this benos suach, this white figs, it says that they don't become, their Shmita year is not till their third year, because their chanata is in that Shmita year proper, is in that first year. Does that mean that their bud falls off in that first year, or by the end of that first year, finally, right, they are 1/3 done? And so there's 2 more years until they're going to be ready for, that they'll be ready for chanata, according to the Rambam, which is 1/3 of the way to full maturity. Okay, so you can see kind of where the Rambam may have gotten it from this Mishnah, but you also appreciate the simpler reading of the majority Rishonim, that chanata means the initial bud falling off and the fruit starting to take root, to actually start to grow. So let's see this Rambam inside briefly. It says the Rambam. This is the Rambam in Hilchos Shmita V'Yovel, again, where the Rambam talks about the laws of Shmita, 4th chapter, 9th halacha. Be'echad b'tishrei, and this is, again, we're in passing, we're going to deal with another debate here, right? Be'echad b'tishrei Rosh Hashanah l'Shmita and l'Yovlos. We say in the first of Tishrei is the Rosh Hashanah for Shmita and Yovel. Now, this is not agreed upon by everybody. There are some who actually think that it's Tu B'Shvat, which is the Rosh Hashanah for trees, which is when you should have the fiscal year start for Shmita. But the Rambam paskins, and this is how we paskin today, which is that Rosh Hashanah, the Rosh Hashanah that we celebrate, is the beginning of the Shmita year. If the fruit that we're talking about are grains, legumes, kitniot are things where the seed is eaten, or peros ha'ilan, fruit of the tree, the yigil onas hamasros, and they have reached this, again, onas hamasros, the time period that they would normally start to require Meiser to be taken off, right? So they've reached whatever that is in Meiser. Kodem Rosh Hashanah, before Rosh Hashanah, Hare Elu Mutar, and these things are mutar because they reached their status before Rosh Hashanah for Shmita. Therefore, they're not Peros Shvius. They are not fruit of the Shmita year because they reached this onas hamasros. They reached this time where they would be chayv and meiser on the previous year already. Even though you are gathering them on the Shmita year, they're like fruit of the 6th year. L'kol davar, for everything. But if they had not yet reached 1/3 finished, Ela achar Rosh Hashanah, until after Rosh Hashanah, Harei hin keper shvius, then they are like peros shvius, then they are in fact fruit of Shmita year, because they didn't reach the Zman of Onas Masros, this time period when Meiser kicks in, until after the Shmita year starts. Now, I've been translating Onas Masrot as 1/3 done based off of the Reisman, but the Rambam doesn't say that clearly. But I want to kind of show you where we get that from. How do we get to that notion of this 1/3 done, and what does it even mean? Right? It's a little bit of a strange thing. Again, I think when you start to see, right, the Jews were a bunch of farmers, and so they perfected the trade, and they did some crazy analysis on the exact timing of these things. And it'd be fascinating if there was a botanist or someone who really knew this stuff who could go and test some of these theories out. I don't know of anyone who's done it, but I think it'd be a really fascinating study. But you'll see what I mean in a couple minutes. So Derech Emuna Hilchos Shmitos, this is a pirish on the Rambam. So this is Sifkat and Samach Daled right here. So he commenting on the Rambam, which says Higil Onas Maisros, that it reached the time period when Meiser would have to be taken. So Das Rabbeinu Dechanata Beilanos, he Onas Masros. So what the Rambam is doing here is saying that the definition of the word chanata, of right, that first initial starting by trees or by fruit of the tree, is actually not when the flower falls off, but it's actually what we would call onas masrot. Right? What is onat masrot? Vehu havas shlish. The definition of onas masrot, of this time period of when meiser kicks in, is havas shlish, which means 1/3 of the way done. V'chein betuo v'kitnios. This is also true by grain and by legumes, or things that you eat the seed. V'avashlish hu onas hamasros. Right, this 1/3 done is by definition the same thing as onas masros shalahen. K'voshi disbar b'perek beis b'maiser ayin sham. As we're going to see briefly when we're going to do this inside the second chapter of Maisros, of the Mishnayos on Meiser, we're going to go check that out. But we'll see there that this is where it's the source for Onas Maestros being 1/3 done. And then there's a couple exceptions, chutz mi tapuchim ve'etrogim, except for apples and etrogim, right? Onas hamasro shalahen, because the definition of when Meiser kicks in for these things is miyad shnasa igol be'odos madar. Right, so these have a different definition, not 1/3 done. They have their own definition. We're not going to get into this right now because it will take us off kilter. But the point is that when the Rambam uses the words onas masros, by almost all things, it means 1/3 done. So we're going to have to see where the Derech Hamuna get this concept that onas masros means 1/3 of the way developed. So let's jump to Mishnayos in Masechet Masrot, the first chapter, Mishnayos Beis and Gimel. So the Mishnayos here deal with the question of when is basically the fiscal year for Meiser. Me'emasai haperos chayabos b'masros. At what point, at what juncture, does a fruit become obligated in Meiser? At what point is it now sufficiently developed that now it's called Meiser, it's called a fruit for this year, and that you have to now count it in your final numbers for Meiser. Excuse me. So the Mishnah continues, Hata'enim mishi yavchilu v'anavim v'avashim mishi hivishan. So it says, okay, so the te'ina, the fig, when this happens to it, the grapes or the avashim, whatever those are, when this happens to it. So basically goes through, I just took a couple of examples and then I gave an ellipses. What the Mishnah does is it gives a whole bunch of different fruit, and it says this fruit is its time period for Meiser, its onas hamasrot is when this happens, and for this fruit, it's when this happens. And each one has its own shtickle Torah, right? Each one has its own, like when the strawberries become slightly red, and when this thing becomes slightly, like each one has its own things. That's the first Mishnah. That's Mishnah Aleph. Mishnah Beis, sorry, that's Mishnah Beis. Mishnah Gimel, Hatlasan, this is the end of Mishnah Gimel. Hatlasan, the fenugreek, Misha Titzmach. Once you could take it, plant it, and it would take root and kind of grow another fenugreek plant, that's when it's Onas Meiser, right? When it could reproduce now another plant. And then it says Hatuava Zaitim, grains and olives, Mishi Yekansu Shlish, when they reach a third of the way of their development. Okay? So right here, by Tvua and Zaitim, by grains and by olives specifically, the Mishnah says that when they are a third done, then they have reached their, what we called their onas hamaiser, or ma'emasai peres chayavos b'maisos. When is the obligation for meiser kick in? For, again, grain and olives, it's when they developed a third of the way. So how do we make sense of, right, this? I didn't bring the whole long list, but each one of these fruits has their own thing. So that's not helpful. I mean, you have to be like a herbologist. You have to know every single fruit. And you have to know exactly what sign for every single fruit is when the Zman Chanata is. I mean, this is an insane headache, right? So on the 6th year, you're going to go crazy trying to mark off all the fruits that have reached or haven't reached, right, their Chanata before Shmitta comes in. I mean, you're going to be Meshiga. So says the Bir Horizon. So how do you make sense of all this? Onas HaMaisros. So what does it mean? What's the definition? What is this thing called Onas HaMaisros? The time when Meiser kicks in. Berov HaPeiros, by most fruit, Hi Mishiyagiu Lishlav Shabo Reuyim Hem L'Hazriya V'Litzmach. So first thing the Reisman says is that according to the rabbis, right, many people understand that when we say Onas Maisros, it's the time when a fruit reaches the point where they start to seed themselves, where if you took that fruit, you could plant it and potentially get a new plant, right, from the fruit itself. V'hainu kishihigiu l'shlish gidulam. And he says, and that is reached when these plants are 1/3 of the way developed. At this point, they're considered like food. And all of the different shiurim, all the different, right? So again, when it says te'enim mishiyavchilu and the anavim v'abashim mishiv ishu, so each one of these things each description, what does that mean? These are what we would call simanim. These are signs as to when exactly these different fruits reached a third of their growth. So all the examples the Mishnah is giving are all what it looks like, what a fruit looks like when it's reached a third of its growth. So again, you have to have a tremendous amount of information for every single fruit. What is a third of its way to final product? What does that look like? Right? Haim simanim lekach. All these things are just signs. Shekvar gadlu dayam, that all these things have grown enough that they are now able to grow. Where do we know this from? That they have to be ra'oi lahazriya. They have to be able to reproduce. If they took that 1/3 of a way produced seed or fruit, that if you took it and planted it, there's potential for it to grow into a new plant. Says the Torah in Devarim Yudalad Chaf Beis, Aser Ta'aser, famous verse, right? You should surely give Meiser. Eskol Tuas Zarecha, all of the grains of your seeds. So what does it mean? The grains of your seeds? So we'll see that Tosos is the first that I know of, but that the Rishonim, what they do is they take this pasuk and they say, oh, Meiser kicks in when the fruit becomes able to, if planted, to reproduce. Now, what that means is that the definition for when a fruit becomes able for Meiser to be taken off is when it reaches what's the Onas HaMeiser, is when it is 1/3 of the way developed, which by the way is also when, if you took it and replanted it, it would be able to potentially lead to another plant, right? So it has the potential to become a seed at that point, and is also right now the time, again, when Meiser has kicked in, and potentially when Shmitta kicks in too. Okay, so if you're just following this, in order to explain this hard Mishnah that we started with in Masechah Shvius about these funny white dates, the introduction of this concept of Onas Maisros and what exactly it means, you have to dig and dig and dig in the laws of Trumas and Maisros in order to understand the application to Shmita. And this is kind of what's so maddening about trying to create an actual simple structure in the context of Shmita, is that very little of it is clear in the laws of Shmita. So much of the halachot are drawn from Maestros, but then there's also differences, as we saw last week by the etrog, right? The etrog, according to some, followed different rules for Meiser and different rules for Shmita. So how is it? What is it? Do they follow the same rules or not follow the same rules? So take a look at this this Tosfos here. This Tosfos again is the source for a lot of this conversation. Uminalan al hanach shiurin hamufrashim b'chol echad b'echad. So the Tosfos is commenting on this section of the Mishnayos earlier that I kind of skipped over. Right, so again, the figs, Mishi of Chilu and the Yanavim, when they're Hav Ishu, and again, it has every single different type of fruit, and it says, oh, when this happens, and when that happens. So the Tosfos says, where do we know all these shurim from? Where do we know all these measurements for each and every fruit? The Chol Echad v'Echad Gabi Peros and Parakama de Maestros. Where do we know this? Right, it goes through every single type of fruit. How do we know exactly when? Says Tosfos, no, you don't understand. Really, the Mishnah is teaching you one halacha. Nearly, the kol osen shiran hu hava shlish. The entire Mishnah is teaching you that when something reaches 1/3 of its way to production, and it's just telling you what it looks like. It's telling you what is a vashlish lahen. What is the 1/3 of production look like for a strawberry? What does it look like for a date or a fig? So why doesn't it just say when it reaches 1/3 of its production? Why doesn't it just say that? Why does it tell you all these other things? Which we have by the very end of the Mishnah by grains and by olives. Because in fact, it's actually helpful. All these other fruit have something external that you can show or point to say, see this? When you see this, you know it's reached 1/3 of its maturity, right? Except for grains and olives, which are harder to tell. The only way to know is just timing. You just know what's the normal length of time that these things take to develop, and then divide by 3, and then you have your answer for how long you need to wait, right? Right, that we saw also in the Yerushalmi by the fenugreek, which says that you have to wait till it's able to be planted and would regrow. Right, so Darish Lo Rav Zera made the where does he get this from? Where does this notion come from? Aser Taser is called Zarecha. Right, again, our pasuk, all of the Zarecha, all the seeds. Davar Shehu Nizra Umatzmiach, something that if you plant it, it will grow. Yatsa Pachos Mishlish She'eno Nizra Ben Atzmiach. If it's less than 1/3 developed, it's not going to be able to grow. And this becomes a fundamental of the rules of Meiser, and why it should translate to Shmita is not clear, but what ends up happening in the Rambam, and it's a very important shita here, is that with the way to establish the timing for the fruits of the tree for Shmita and Yovel is what? Is whether or not the fruit reached its Onas HaMeiser before or after Rosh Hashanah. Okay? And so this is a very, very long, complicated conversation, bringing in Mishnayos from 3 different Masechtos and the Rishonim and the Achronim on them to explain a very basic idea, right? At the end of the day, all we come away from so far with this whole conversation is that when we're trying to establish when exactly a fruit it becomes Perot Shvius, when does it become the fruit of a Shemitah year? So we establish it goes Basar Chanata. What does Chanata mean? Chanata has 2 possible definitions. Definition 1, like Rashi and the majority of the Rishonim, Chanata is simply the very beginning of the fruit developing. When the flower falls off of the bud, at that moment, the fruit starts to develop. Once the flower falls off, you can establish what year this fruit is for Shemitah, right? Is it year 6, year 7, year 8? Well, when was the Chanata? Whenever that was, that's going to define. But the Rambam introduces to us in the world of Shemitah, he introduces us to the concept of Meiser. He says, you have to know what Onas Meiser is, the time period when a fruit becomes obligated in what year for Meiser purposes is going to be relevant for us to define Chanata. Chanata means when it reaches Onas HaMaaser. What's Onas HaMaaser? So as we just saw, after going through it, Onas HaMaaser is 1/3 of the way developed. Why 1/3 of the way developed? Because the Torah says, Aser Ta'aser, Estuat Zarecha, that you should surely bring Meiser for the seeds, right, of your Tvua, of your grains. In other words, when do you take Meiser? When your produce would be able to reproduce. When your produce could reproduce, at that point, it is developed sufficiently that is established its fiscal year. And that, for the Rambam, is important, not just for Meiser, but for the definition of Chanata and on Shmita. And so there you have already, right, one layer of the complexity to defining what year a fruit is. Is this a Shemitah product, or is this a 60-year product? Is this a Shemitah product or a year 1 product for the next cycle, right? And depending on how you define this one piece, plays a pretty big impact. It has a pretty big practical distinction. So my goal for tonight was to try to very clearly explain why this entire topic is such a headache. Because really, when you start to peel back and try to figure out where do we get this from, right? Where's this idea of, you start to realize that it gets very murky very quickly, because you have a couple of amorphous mishnayos that have to draw from other places. And to be honest, my instinct tells me that when Jews were farmers, a lot of this stuff was much simpler to them when they were learning this stuff, because they were living with the fruit and the vegetables day in, day out. This is what their expertise was. They were an agrarian society. It was all about the farm and understanding exactly how to read all these things. Today, we look at this stuff and we're like, what is going on? I don't even know what a benos suach is. What's a white fig? I don't even know what that is, right? So forget what's a fenugreek. Like what? Like we don't even know that if we found them in a store cut up, we still don't even know what it is, right? Forget planting it, knowing how when it's a third. So my feeling is that this topic has become so foreign to us. It's kind of like kudshim. It's kind of like the world of right tuma and tara, of purity and impurity. It's a whole world that we're not used to really entangling ourselves in. And so my goal again is to slowly build up our background so that we can kind of dig into some of the really practical stuff for the time that we live now. but it requires a couple more of these types of classes that just dig into the Mishnayos and the Gemaras that form the basis for these conversations. So we'll come back to this. And again, thank you for coming. I know that there were other options. I hope this was clear. We'll stop here for any thoughts or questions.
Oh, thank you.
I just was thinking in terms of talking about a third of the way through.
Sorry, Fred, what was that?
That's well, in terms of talking about the. Oh, there's feedback. Where am I getting? I'm getting feedback.
Yeah, try again.
Anyway, so talking about a third of the way through, when we're talking about food, being able to put it on the bleck for Shabbos, we talk about a third of the way. At least.
Yeah, so I mean it's interesting. It's fascinating that it's the numbers bear out, although it's a debate whether it's a third or a half. But
yeah,
it's a yeah. So sorry. So do you have a question, or was the?
No, I just an observation. It was just popped
I think it's totally random.
Relationship. Yeah,
it's totally random. Okay. Because the definition of a third of the way cooked through there is based off of a very strange concept, but it has to be. The idea is that if something is cooked enough to be edible for some, then the assumption is that you're not going to have the instinct to stoke the coals if it's not cooking more, because it's cooked enough, as opposed to if it's not cooked enough for even anybody to eat, then you're going to be much more likely to, try to nudge the coals. Right. So
and the level of being edible at a third cooked is pretty low.
Is pretty low
in terms of who would be willing to eat at that.
Yep. That's why I say they call it Michael Ben Drusai. He was apparently a ganov, a robber who was constantly on the go because he had the authorities after him. So he ate a lot of partially cooked foods because he had to leave the scene fast. So that's where that comes from. So I didn't think about it. I didn't put two and two together. You're right though, right? Most people define Michael Ben Drusai as a third of the way cooked, which is fascinating. That it just happens to work out that it's the same ratio, but I actually think there's nothing. I think it's just a coincidence.
No connection. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Be well, everyone. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Night.
Bye, everyone.